Chapter 5. The Man Known as Mark Twain. When I was a boy, there was but one permanent ambition among my comrades in our village on the west bank of the Mississippi River. That was to be a steamboat man. Mark Twain, Life on the Mississippi. Like many river towns in the mid-1800s, Hannibal, Missouri was a quiet, sleepy place. Some people called it boring. But young Samuel Langhorne Clemens wasn't like most people. He spent every free moment searching for adventure and excitement. To him, there was a world of magic not far from his family's house. It was called the Mississippi River. Sam wasn't crazy about school. In fact, he often played hooky. But he loved to read. The books he liked best told stories of faraway places. When he wasn't reading, he headed down to the river. Sam and his friends swam, built rafts, caught fish, walleye, catfish, trout, sturgeon, and paddlefish, and explored caves. As for Sam, nothing fascinated him as much as watching boats. Keelboats and broadhorn barges came and went from the wharf. Where are they heading? He wondered. He had heard stories about exciting downriver cities like St. Louis, Memphis, and New Orleans, and cities farther north like St. Paul, Minnesota, and Davenport, Iowa. What were these cities like? Were they like the places he had read about in books? Steamboats were the most exciting boats. At night, Sam stayed awake, listening for the sound of their foghorns. During the day, he watched them go by, carrying goods and people, gray smoke billowing from their smokestacks, whistles blowing. "Steamboat a-comin'," someone would call, and the quiet town would come alive. Doors flew open. Streets filled with people as they hurried down toward the wharf. Kids appeared from all directions and raced to the river. On the wharf, Sam and his friends waited for the deckhands to tie up the steamboat. Cargo and mail was unloaded. Passengers strolled off. Many had traveled to the Mississippi from other rivers, like the Illinois, Ohio, or the Missouri. For some, Hannibal was the last stop. Others were heading south to places Sam dreamed of visiting. Music on the Mississippi. Besides books, the Mighty Miss has inspired countless songs, everything from sad ballads like Old Man River, written for the Broadway musical Showboat in 1927, to catchy tunes like Mississippi Mud. Country singer Johnny Cash lived about 20 miles west of the Mississippi. As a boy, he watched the water spill over the banks and spread out across the land. One of his most famous songs, 5 Feet High and Rising, tells the story of a river rising higher and higher. From its birthplace in New Orleans, jazz spread to other cities, in part thanks to the Mississippi River. How did this happen? In 1919, a 17-year-old black musician from New Orleans took a job playing cornet in a band on a riverboat traveling as far as Minneapolis. The musician's name was Louis Armstrong. A few years later, he moved to Chicago, where some of his most famous records were produced. Sam enjoyed talking to the passengers, but it was cabin boys, deckhands, cub pilots, engineers, and captains that he was waiting for. There was so much to learn. What kind of fuel was used to heat the steam in the boilers? What was beyond that bend down river? How long did it take to get to New Orleans? As for the pilot, he was the most interesting of all to Sam Clemens. Pilots were adventurous. They were loners who didn't talk much, yet people admired them. Sam Clemens was determined to be a Mississippi River pilot someday. Sam's early childhood was happy. His father was a judge. There was plenty of money, but then, when he was in 5th grade, everything changed. Sam's father died. The money was gone. Sam would have to quit school and get a job. Sam worked for a printer. He learned about letters and words and newspapers. Soon he was writing funny little stories that were published in the local paper. Sam never went back to school, but he kept on reading. Maybe someday he would be a writer when he wasn't being a river pilot. In 1852, when Sam was 17 years old, he packed his bags and headed south to St. Louis, where in time he found himself a job on a steamboat. As a cub pilot, he spent hours and hours watching the pilot, asking endless questions, struggling to understand each answer. "My boy, you've got to know the shape of the river perfectly. It is all there is left to steer by on a very dark night. Everything else is blotted out and gone. But mind you, it hasn't the same shape in the night that it has in the daytime." "How on earth am I ever going to learn that?" "How on earth am I ever going to learn it then?" "How do you follow a hall at home in the dark?" "Because you know the shape of it." Mark Twain, Life on the Mississippi. On April 9th, 1859, Sam Clemens's dream came true. He became a fully licensed steamboat pilot. For 2 years, he traveled the Mississippi, exploring all those faraway cities he had wondered about since he was a boy. Sam loved being a pilot, but his time on the river didn't last long. In 1861, the Civil War began. The United States was at war with itself. Battles broke out along the Mississippi River. The river was closed to all traffic except military boats. Mark Twain chooses his name. Sam Clemens became one of America's funniest and best-loved writers. He didn't write in a fancy way. He wrote plainly. His characters spoke the way real, everyday Americans did. 2 of his most famous books are The Adventures of Tom Sawyer and The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. In Life on the Mississippi, he told what it was like to grow up beside the river and learn to be a river pilot. In his books, he didn't use his real name. All of his books were published under the name Mark Twain. Many writers use names for their books that are different than their real names. They are called pen names. Sam Clemens chose a name from something he had learned on the river. River pilots lowered poles or lines into the water to measure how deep it was. Sometimes they'd call out, "Mark Twain!" Mark Twain, or mark number 2, was the second mark on the line on the pole. It meant the water was 12 feet deep and safe enough to pass.